Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Kerry Wiggum and I'm a co-director of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, or I-GMAP. I want to begin, as we always do, by acknowledging that we are on the ancestral land of the Oneida and Onondaga peoples, two groups that have survived and resisted genocide and continue to do so to this day. Thank you so much for coming this evening, this very important evening and day for this country. And an appropriate time to be thinking about the question that our speaker is going to pose to us and surely answer. We're really lucky to be joined this week at I-GMAP by our second visiting practitioner of the semester, Kate Ferguson, who is the co-executive director of Protection Approaches. Protection Approaches, I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit about the work that they do, is really one of the most inventive and successful atrocity prevention NGOs in the world. It's based in London, and Kate in particular, aside from being a friend and a colleague, is just one of the most thoughtful and creative thinkers in the field of atrocity prevention. So we're really honored to have her join us at Binghamton this week and honored to have her speak to us tonight. So I'm going to turn things over now to Dr. Kate Ferguson.
Thanks, Kerry. I mean, that was too generous an introduction, because how do you follow that? I will only disappoint you if I'm set up on such a stool. But it is really, honestly, such a pleasure to just be here at Binghamton in this extraordinary school that I'm so jealous of. Every time I hear about what is happening when I visit, I wish I could have done these degrees. I still would kind of like to come back and do some more. It's really a very rare treat to get the platform of a kind of like a public lecture where you get to talk and think out what's been going on in my own head. So thank you for coming and going on this journey with me. I'm not going to talk actually about protection approaches because I talk about PA all of the time, so we're gonna go in a slightly different direction. But thank you for being such generous hosts, and particularly to Kerry and Max, and to Amanda who brought me here, and made sure that I did everything I needed to do, even though I was really tardy, so thank you. I should also really thank my colleagues at Protection Approaches, because they have also let me have a week to be here. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the UK is going through some flux and change at the moment. It's a lot. So when I said, yeah, I'm off for a week, I'm lucky that I have such great colleagues to let me do that. Yeah, I've set myself this rather ambitious title. Not because I think I have the answers, although I am going to put some suggestions, but because I think we need to start thinking on a longer time frame. We're a group of people, a movement, a sector that has prevention in its title. And as I will kind of discuss, I don't know if we're actually always that good at remembering that. I recognise that today is election day here. So that's actually, even though it wasn't planned, I'm glad we're taking a higher altitude look. We're not looking immediately at what is happening right now here in the US, in my own country, in the UK, in the world. We're looking at a higher altitude a bit further down the tracks. And I like that because one, we do need to, and there is an imperative to do so, but the other, it allows us to open our mind a bit and to be a bit more ambitious and a bit more creative. So if we can try and pull, and I know that's easy as an outsider and a foreigner on election day to say, but maybe in this space, before we know what happens with the results, we can suspend our disbelief and look a little bit further down the tracks. And I am hoping that there's going to be some time for some discussion, so please do be thinking about what you think needs to happen differently around that kind of, I'm looking towards that mid-century point, 2050. Not necessarily where we will all be, that's an upsetting conversation, but where our sector is and where the ambitions are. Lots of what I'm talking about today has been sort of swirling around my mind in a very unstructured way, which will possibly come out. But some of it really is rooted in a paper that I wrote with my colleague Fred Carver last year, And so anything that sounds like a semblance of sense, almost certainly is Fred's ideas. And so I just want to acknowledge that as I'm talking and taking us through this view, Fred is due a lot of credit for one, helping me work out some of these thoughts, and also because I'm drawing a lot on the paper that we wrote, being the difference. Lastly, I just want to say I can't be here really without thinking about Nadia. Her brilliance and her work and her spirit is so very evident here. I only got to know her during the pandemic, but she was really a very remarkable person to go through the pandemic on calls with. So I sort of feel her here. So the things that are more radical, I've kept in because I think she wouldn't have wanted me to take them out. I've always been really, really interested in the temporality of what we have in mind when we're talking and thinking about preventing mass atrocities. Because the timelines that we think to, and those of us that work to change, they're rightly always altering according to the context, perspective, and opportunity. And so some of us will often talk about a cycle of prevention, right? So it is needed at every stage of the crisis. It's needed before, it's needed during, it's needed after. In Ukraine today, where the kind of pathology of violence, and particularly the mass atrocities, they're ongoing, there are still actions that can be taken that can help mitigate that violence, that can help prevent some crimes, protect some lives. The same in Syria. A decade in, there are still things that can be taken that can prevent some of those crimes from happening. And that means saving some of those lives. In Tigray, in Myanmar, in Cameroon, in Afghanistan. And this urgent stage of atrocity prevention is really crucial, and it is one that I and the others spend most of our days concerned with. But that's not what I want us to talk about today. I'm going to ask you to stretch your timelines, to look to the future, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, to the midpoint of a century, and consider, can we even think about it? Can we even think really, apart from an ideas exercise, which maybe is worthwhile in itself? How can we really start to grasp what is coming down the tracks in that period? We're living in an era where atrocity violence appears to be rising inside and outside of conflict. Many of the core drivers of identity-based violence and atrocity, they're going in the wrong direction. We know this. And yet, a lot of people, including those that are in powerful positions, particularly I'm thinking within states, but also donors that hold a lot of cash, those within the multilateral institutions, sometimes even colleagues that kind of work within our space, continue to see mass atrocities as very rare events, when in reality, like, they are not, unfortunately, particularly exceptional. They are, in fact, fairly frequent, they're predictable, and like when you give context, the means of criminal enterprise, motivation of identity-based bigotry or violence, the manipulation of identity, the opportunity of unchecked power, they become more and more likely, and that is the same wherever you are in the world. And those risk factors, to greater or lesser extent, are present everywhere. And so what happens if these global trends, already bleak, continue unchecked? What happens when the propellants of climate-related weather change, when population movements, again related to climate change and its impacts, when shortages of food, when water rises, when these things that are already happening, what happens when they start speeding up? Because one of the premises of my kind of question to you today, or to our sector, is competition over resources and the continued weaponization of energy sources, the impacts of climate change more broadly intensify. And so long as our responses to climate change and our efforts to kind of slow down the climate emergency don't take in a central manner, due attention to human rights, and particularly identity-based grievance, I find it very difficult to see a world that is not really sort of scorched by an escalation and frequency of identity-based atrocity crimes. I don't think we need to be experts in forecasting to recognise that mass atrocity crimes have not become a feature of the past, but are in fact a mounting challenge of our future. I don't think it's hyperbolic for me to say that, but for some reason we resist saying that out loud, and certainly policymakers don't want to hear it. These risks, and particularly those related to climate change and its impacts, have to become central in the practice and in how we conceive our responsibilities around atrocity prevention. The trajectory of climate change and its impacts must force a juncture in our work. Now, those of us that are concerned with atrocity crime prevention, those of us more broadly that seek a safer, more just and equitable world, we're also faced by another juncture, and that's Ukraine. The violence we're seeing in Ukraine is unquestionably the consequence of the collective failure over the past 20 or so years to confront widespread, systematic and deliberate attacks on the rights of life, freedom, justice in other parts of the world, particularly, but not only, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Myanmar, the United States, Europe, the list goes on. What is happening in Ukraine is a consequence of that past failure. And this crisis comes not coincidentally as the global commitment and principles of the UN system and to human rights are already severely strained. European hegemony at the United Nations has for some time been fracturing, long before what's happened in Ukraine. That traditional bloc that served as the kind of bulwark on human rights, rightly or wrongly, but very importantly at the United Nations, is no longer nearly so stable. Russia's long-time efforts to be undermining that international system, that can be seen in some of those cases, most particularly in Syria, but also elsewhere, it has been bolstered over the last several years by the Trump administration, by the intensification of China's attacks on their own domestic populations and rights, by global trends more broadly, away from broad-based political affiliation towards factional and identity politics, and that is something that we see, that factionalism, we see in practically every democracy in the world today. And so Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the very nature of the violence, and that matters, it has forced this juncture for Europe, for the United Nations, for the kind of global balance sheet on rights and authoritarianism, because the threat of nuclear war games, explicit challenges that the war and atrocity crimes deliberately pose to the international system, to the impact that the crisis is having on global supply chains from oil and gas to wheat and grains, the scope and scale and visibility of that violence has forced the need for a global reset. It should have happened earlier. I thought it was going to happen over Syria. It did not. But we can't always choose how these junctures in the history of rights emerge. And I trained as a historian, so this might be my bias. I do take a longer view than some of our international relations scholars and our policy-making colleagues. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine has forced such a moment, but how we respond is very much up to us. And whether we bring the past failures as part of that response, part of our mindset, or whether we only respond to Ukraine, that is up to us. President Zelensky said to the UN Security Council in April this year that the goals set in San Francisco in 1945 during the creation of a global international security organization have not been achieved, and it is impossible to achieve them without reforms. And he's right. It was right before he said it, and it was right before Russia invaded Ukraine. But we now have a conversation about UN reform that is much more prominent and given much more attention and has been kind of flowed out. And that's an opportunity. Moments of outcry, moments that demand change, and that set new ambitions have always, and always imperfectly, that is very important, always imperfectly, shaped the history of human rights. Just to give one example, while the world most certainly failed to protect populations from widespread atrocity crimes in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s, the collective and global outrage across states and civil society fed a momentum that led to the adoption by 120 states to the Rome Statute in 1998, the adoption of the resolution on the protection of civilians in 1999, the first resolution of women, peace and security in 2000, the opening of the International Criminal Court in 2002, and of course the universal adoption of the responsibility to protect in 2005. Now the raising of expectations for and of the international community that took place in those years, it should never be oversimplified, it should never be glorified, but it does serve as a very important reminder in this very bleak moment to remind us what can and should kind of emerge out of the ashes of these bleak moments. And so, you know, just as the founding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the and the United Nations, they were born out similarly of the shadows of the Second World War, of the Holocaust. We have to think then what this juncture right now, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the failures before it that enabled that invasion has forced for us. And it can't lead to a settling or a lowering of our values. Now, any such movement that we have now, today, or what we sort of dream forward in the rest of our time together now, there is no way that it should be allowed to return to the narrow elite liberalism that characterised that period. And it must necessarily be global. Both because it is the right thing to do, but it builds the sustainability. You know, we have to learn from what wasn't done at the beginning of this century. But it's also because the Kremlin and other spoilers are deft at exploiting the divisions within the global system, at promoting those narratives of Western imperialism and of capitalizing on a very real political public disappointment around the shortfalls of the 1945 human rights agenda. But that malevolence and success of Russia's strategy does not cancel out the reality of a divided global system, the impacts of Western imperial and colonial history, and the disappointments that many of us, probably in this room, not to mention around the world, do feel around some of those letdowns. So any reimagining of responsible internationalism, which is in the background of my suggestions I'm going to lay out for you, it requires a genuine reckoning with that reality. And I don't say that as an add-on. I say it first because it is central, but it can't be enough to put us off trying. So that's the background, right, of mounting challenge, but also a rare opportunity that I want to kind of ground this conversation in, because this lecture is not intended to be bleak. It is actually intended to be quite hopeful. I know you laugh, but I think at the end of it, I am really an optimist. Because I do want us to be brave and look down those tracks at what is coming. But it's really about recognizing our agency and that juncture, right? We have a terrifying juncture caused by the consequences of climate change that are already locked in. But we also then have this juncture of, I think, responsibility that Ukraine has forced to do things differently. So I'm going to talk about just 3 things that we can do differently, whether that's on a state level, a multilateral level, as a movement. I'm always more interested in what states can do, so my remarks might accidentally tend there. But these are meant to be at an altitude that can be taken at any kind of level. The first is conceptual. Then we're going to move a little bit down in altitude to the political. And then the third, we're really going to get concrete, which is my strategic recommendation, where I will indulge in being geeky of the mechanistic changes that we can do. First, we'll start right at the top in the air, which is around need to change how we conceive the problem that we're talking about. How do we really think about identity-based atrocity crimes? And that's really the violence that I'm concerned with. I'm not an expert in war crimes. It's a very different pathology of violence. So I'm really talking about identity-based atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing. Now, I've talked about how we can change our understanding of this kind of violence a lot before. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but we do need to really push at the boundaries of how identity-based violence and mass atrocities are understood, particularly where they come from, where they occur, and the scale of the challenge. I think I've set out something of the scale of the challenge. I don't need to rehash how grim the horizons are. But let's think about where they occur and where they come from. First, we need to acknowledge that there is no, and never has been, clear binary between protector and perpetrator states. All states are both. And that is not to draw ever any kind of moral equivalency of experience or responsibility, but it is to acknowledge that all states are both. Now, that's great because that means that the starting point can be all states can do better. And going back to that earlier challenge of what the multilateral system is facing, that is actually helpful. That has not been the approach of atrocity prevention at the multilateral level, not to mention conversations around R2P. That needs to become the new baseline. We also need to continue to open up our approach to identity-based violence and atrocity crimes, recognizing that the more inclusive, the more intersectional, and the more connected that our thinking becomes, the more effective the prevention will be. This drawing very sharp lines about who atrocity prevention is for and who it is not should be like the antithesis of what we believe in. And yet, for some reason, that has not always been the way my sector has behaved. The dominance and very narrow kind of politicized understanding of genocide is responsible for a lot of that, and we need to keep moving away. I think from that kind of unhelpful paradigm. And in particular, we need to recognize that in context of mass violence, those who are already, when the violence begins, perceived to be marginalized, minoritized, or more vulnerable, will always be at risk of compounded threats. And that is something that has been really absent, I think, from a lot of conversations around how we actually do atrocity prevention and whose voice is centered and who is invited around a table. And so our collective work, therefore, has to then be informed by and led by a far more varied spectrum of needs and experience and expertise. And what's nice is that that conceptual opening leads seamlessly into an opening up of who atrocity prevention belongs to and where the responsibility to protect people, like where that actually lies. Now, I love to talk about the definition of the responsibility to protect, but I will try not to now, but we can come back to it in questions, and definitely in our chats over the week it will come up. But R2P was this commitment made in 2005 at the United Nations as part of that kind of moment of global change. Where it fell down is that it stayed in those rooms. The same can also be said for many of those other steps forward. R2P, though, may be more than a lot of those steps forward. We need to ensure that this conceptualization of responsibility towards those that are more vulnerable, or the responsibility to build a more equitable world, is something that flows out, not as taken from the UN. We need the UN, broken and limited as it is, we need it. But that responsibility needs to flow out. States need to do their bit, which is where a lot of the work I do is concerned with, because, unfortunately we live in a state-centric world and states are the ones that hold the power. But that responsibility doesn't stop there either. It flows through to all of us, to the composite parts of those societies, whether that's civil society, whether that's business, whether that's researchers, whether that's us as individuals. And whether we use the language of R2P or not, that matters not really very much, but recognising that opening of who atrocity prevention belongs to has implications that I think will come out in the rest of my remarks. Related, we need to ground our work in the fundamental commitment and acknowledgement that the prevention of identity-based violence is not needed in some places some of the time, but everywhere all of the time. Identity-based violence is something that exists in some form or another in every single society. The mistake has been to think that mass atrocities come from the same places of armed conflict. That is not in fact true. The risks of atrocities can rise in places that in fact do not score very low on instability. Now, for those of us that work in this field, right, it's really important to acknowledge that that opening up of a conceptualization, that doesn't bring a burden of more work. It's just the opportunity to increase the size of our table and to reach across the aisle and to work more collaboratively. And again, you know, that sounds as if it is obvious, but it isn't. It's not a nice to have, it's the need to be much more connected, but also stop allowing atrocity prevention to be seen as something marginal in foreign policy or domestic policy. It's central. I think we have to be really blunt. Identity-based violence and identity-based atrocities represent a pathology of violence and power that is a core and growing global destabilizer. So that is our conceptual vision. I said we are not going to be bleak. It's going to be a bit more positive, I think, now in my next two. We'll see. So my second call is what we can do on the political level. Now, this might seem really, really obvious, but please stick with me. But my call is that the priority for atrocity prevention should be prevention. Because I still don't think it is. Not in how it is actually implemented by states or assessed by academic critique or conceptualized in the press. There are, of course, fabulous organizations that are driving it, and others. But on the whole, I don't think prevention is coming first. We see that resourcing and political capital devoted to both responding but also punishing ongoing atrocities far outweigh that applied to upstream ways to sort of prevent atrocities from occurring in the first place. The active management of potential atrocity crimes and wider dynamics of conflict and instability does not just save lives, it also saves resources. Prevention is always cheaper than cure. I'm not saying anything new. This has been the kind of like bedrock of parts of this sector, but it is not taking place. Now, I think I maybe want to take this call further then, because no matter how many people like me stand up and say prevention is cheaper than cure, we still don't get any money, and the policies don't change. So we have to think about why that is. Now, yes, the primary objective of atrocity prevention should therefore always be proactive at whatever stage of the crisis, you know, or cause for concern we may be in. Again, obvious. Now, why then aren't most states, particularly those that are also foreign aid donors, responding to crises rather than trying to get ahead of them? It's a political habit and a policy habit that goes far beyond how states address atrocity crimes. Financial, human, diplomatic resource is disproportionately oriented to reacting rather than preparing. And that's the prevailing approach. Yes, particularly to global conflict and mass atrocities, but also the impacts of technological change. We're just responding, we're not trying to get ahead of it. To pandemics, as we lived through. Still now, there's not enough preventative work being done to prevent the next one. To population movements, not because people shouldn't be able to travel freely and move freely, but because population movements can have a massive destabilizing impact on politics and safety and all sorts of things. So why don't we try and have a system that can get ahead of it and support people, rather than just react to these crises that then everyone loses out? And on the whole, it's the response to climate change. Not only, and I'm not a climate expert, so don't come at me, but like on the whole, it is one of response. So we're responding and we're firefighting. And states are responding and firefighting, and it's not just atrocity prevention that can't win that argument. We just look like we're losing because we've got prevention in the name, so like we're evidently doing worse, but that's actually not a reality. And so despite all of that, the principles of crisis prevention teach us, and we're here in this room, we know atrocity prevention, so this isn't going to be news to us. Any kind of crisis can exacerbate and cause moments of stress that then leads to rapid fracture, sharply exacerbating existing instabilities, vulnerabilities, and all sorts of kinds of risks, whether on the economic scale, the human scale, and so on. Atrocity risks can be part of the fallout from that, but not only. Even in, as I said before, in contexts where traditional risk factors of instability are low. Now think of natural hazards or pandemics, disasters, flooding, earthquakes, these political ruptures. Sustained crises like economic recession, these can all have tremendous impact on places and people that may previously have considered themselves safe, as well as in contexts that are more fragile. And I say that humbly, realizing the very real challenges that the United States has been facing in the last few years and what might come in the next few years. But in other words, all states must be prepared to meet global threats and to do so in a similar way at home as they do abroad. So we need this kind of harmonization. Now let's then think about what it actually is that I'm calling for, my optimism. Prevention first systems and prevention first policy, they look at threats that can still be prevented, mitigated, or avoided at every stage. And most states already integrate some kind of prevention thinking and employ some kind of future-oriented and foresight policy making. And I know this sounds kind of like IR or like spacey talk when we're talking about foresight or future-oriented work, but we are suspending our disbelief and looking at the midpoint of the century, so try and stay with me. I'm such a geek, I actually quite like that language, but take something practical like the Sustainable Development Goals or net emissions targets. These are like tangible, if ambitious, long-term objectives to national strategies that many governments and many states through, several governments have committed to. Public health, very often geared towards prevention. Many states and cities develop things like, urban violence reduction. Prevention thinking exists in parts of government. It just doesn't exist properly in foreign policy. And it certainly doesn't exist when we're talking about human rights and when we're talking about conflict and atrocity prevention, whether at home or abroad. So some states, like the US or the UK, they are already more consciously integrating global horizon scanning and these kinds of sort of quite nerdy techniques that use big data, qualitative data. They're trying to see what's coming. They're trying to kind of understand a longer view and explore a range of scenarios, possible futures, as a way to kind of ensure that the country has the best chance of navigating. That's happening. Again, not with a human rights lens, not with atrocity prevention or conflict prevention at its centre. And it is rightly becoming more common to prepare for emerging challenges and opportunities, to respond to projected trends, and to understand known unknowns, unknown unknowns, this kind of like intelligence speak. So we're seeing some movement about what prevention is, even within governments, that we are finding quite challenging at the moment and quite tough. So that is good news. Now, prevention first thinking should support policymakers in making better informed decisions by ensuring that they first considered future eventualities, they've done scenario planning. It's also a way of thinking, you know, you're trying to think 360 about what is the consequence of my actions. Now, we could definitely have a conversation about where that hasn't happened on foreign policy decisions taken by the US and the UK. We need to think about how that can be better centred. Now, these techniques, they're already being used by certain policymakers to navigate the uncertainty that their policy field faces, and to do so in a structured ways. Now, that all sounds sensible, that all sounds logical. But unfortunately, these strategies are only in their infancy. And so we're kind of not there yet in our own world and with what we are concerned with here today. It's not yet being applied to how states, multilats, or even a lot of organisations think about, you know, how mass atrocity events can be grappled with. Prevention thinking in general, it's still not properly prized by states as governments face increasingly rapid news cycles, the dual pressures of rising populism, shrinking resource. It encourages bureaucracies to shrink, to cut what is not immediately needed, to hone out and hollow out the civil service. On the one hand, the COVID-19 pandemic raised public as well as policy expectations regarding preparedness for crises, including social resilience, but also in systems thinking. But at the same time, these wider trends, they're in fact narrowing public attention. Our world and our expectations, they become increasingly immediate, and the pace of our life, it just speeds up, it speeds up. And so the contestation that we are all witnessing and participating in for the future of democracy, I mean, literally whether here today, what happens with your elections, or in the UK where last month our third Prime Minister in a year was outlived by a lettuce. We really feels like making medium and long-term planning impossible, right? Because we do need to be real, even if I'm trying to sell you on these big ideas. And we have to find a way to change this. Now, if we're going to confront that challenge, and we're going to look for those changes that centre prevention and prevention policy and those resources and that expertise, whether at the multilateral level, civil society, the donors that fund this work, we have to start thinking in longer time frames. And we have to look at what is coming rather than what is right in front of us, even if what is in front of us is terrifying and also then very distracting because of all of the other things that we have in front of our lives. Now, that means very practically, and this is the challenge, we need to change the temporal scope that politicians and governments think in. And that also means changing the expectations of voters. And I do think that it's a real shame that this sort of turn away we're seeing from some corners of funding away from preventative work to more immediate human rights and humanitarian challenges is understandable given the scale of the grim picture that, you know, we face here in the US, domestically in the UK, around the world. But I actually think that, in fact, investing in and communicating commitment to meaningfully confront and prepare for crises could actually emerge as the counterweight to plummeting trust in institutions and governments and, in fact, democracy all over the world. So that's my big news, that's my pitch. I do think that we have to confront this short-termism that is stymieing our response to the technological revolution, to trends of democratic backsliding, to mass atrocities and conflict, to climate collapse, to looming global economic peril. Short-termism doesn't work, and we're up against a really stacked system, but we have to, and to do that we then need to pivot. And that pivot requires us, who believe and understand in the gains to be made from prevention and prevention-rooted politics, to really unapologetically make that case. And that might mean us doing things differently and talking in a different way, maybe finding different allies who know how to communicate to the right people. Maybe we need to be actually not thinking about donors in the humanitarian and human rights space, but donors in the political kind of landscape. It also means a lot more people committed to prevention getting into politics, joining the systems that are broken, and forging those pathways to change and prevention and change ourselves. I don't know if it's the same in the US, but in the UK, a whole generation and a half of people committed to changing the world, whether domestically or internationally, did not go into party politics. They joined NGOs, they joined, sometimes joining the government. They set up their own businesses, they did all sorts of things, but there was this kind of dearth of internationalist-oriented young politics because we felt that there was no political home for us. We are partly paying that consequence now. Now we are kind of reaching a different era of our own professional responsibility. Don't do that here. I know the system is whack and it's so biased and broken, but it is much easier to make the case when you are inside the system than outside. It's also not just governments and political parties that are not doing this work. In 2019, Protection Approaches did a survey of 100 actors that were engaged in some kind of identity-based violence prevention work in Europe, whether outside Europe or inside Europe. We did this 4-day consultation with them. Not a single person or organisation was doing prevention work or thinking about being prepared for crises that they could not yet see. Whether that was another spike in refugee and migrants trying to seek sanctuary in the UK. Even though in 2016, what that did to Europe's politics caused a massive swing to the right and a massive backlash of refugee and immigration rights. No one was looking at what would happen if there was a climate event in Europe. No one was looking about what should happen if there was a pandemic. No one was looking at what would happen if mass atrocities returned to Europe. Now, 3 years later, I don't have to tell you how many of those things have happened in Europe. And yet, that was a prevention-rooted consultation. So we also have some thinking to do ourselves about how to do that. So that's the ask that I'm putting forward. That's the second one, that's the political change. We need to somehow make the case for prevention politics. And ultimately, that is about changing the democratic compact. So we're still at quite a high altitude. I'm now going to bring us down to my third and final recommendation or call. This is the practical one. This is what can be done now. This is a systems change question. And this is about prevention strategy. So if we think we've had prevention politics, this is prevention strategy. Now, the practice and policy of mass atrocity prevention has for a very long time been informed by the pursuit of better understanding the processes that make atrocity crimes more likely. Things like hate speech, divisive ideology, corruption, and so on. We have these frameworks. We have a good sense of the processes that make this violence more likely. And in that sense, there is a solid evidence base to our sector that actually makes us a bit different from other parts of the human rights movement. However, the people and networks and behaviours, the decisions, the transactions that drive those processes are far less commonly the target in atrocity prevention policy, diplomacy or strategy. And again, particularly on that state level. States might invest in hate speech related activity to try and counter it, usually. But it's not necessarily informed by the people, networks and behaviours that need to change. Now, knowing what to look for, how to analyse the information, and then how to raise the alarm, these are fundamental principles of warning and effective preventative action. But they are actually not, if you think about it, activities that automatically produce strategic thinking or that identify policy options. It just tells you that something's wrong, and then you need to communicate it up. Without having a sense of what you can then do, you're just better informed, but still not necessarily making change. Now, atrocity prevention analysis has tended to focus on indicators of risk that are frequently missed by conflict and instability assessments. Now that is good and that is important. The consequence, though, of not focusing on the network dynamics that drive those risks leaves us with a policy and strategic gap. And so the result, I think, is that we've had more of a theoretical conceptualization, particularly of genocide, but not only, rather than a strategic one. Now, I hope we can agree that the goal of atrocity prevention is to change harmful behaviours or constrict and disrupt malign actors in order to secure that kind of behaviour change, right? That's why we want to make some kind of intervention, whatever that intervention might be, whether it's sort of peace building, whether it is sanctions, whatever the tool is, we're doing it to make that violence less likely. Now, unfortunately, state-led atrocity prevention in particular the US and the UK, the European Union, their approach to atrocity crimes are far more reactive and punitive, and not necessarily designed to change behaviour, to target transactions, or to even truly understand the motives that are enabling the perpetration in the first place. And that doesn't mean I don't think condemnation and punishment isn't a very important part. It can't be the only piece if what our goal is, let's prevent further violence and let's save more lives. Now, let's take the response to Russia's campaign of atrocities in Ukraine, because this has overwhelmingly followed this tradition, but not totally. In fact, it is one of the instances where we have seen a commitment to try and think on a grand strategic level how to change the behaviours that are leading to that violence. So that indicates that there's some political commitment that is shifting, and that again is important when we think about the junctures that we're at and what we want to push at. Likewise, the atrocities committed by China in Xinjiang are also forcing the atrocity prevention community and also some policymakers to rethink what levers are kind of at their disposal. It matters that both China and Russia are on the Security Council. They're big powers. They're both nuclear powers. It is forcing a conversation away from the traditional playbook, which has been sort of condemnation, investigation, maybe in some situations a no-fly zone. You know, like we have a very limited kind of toolbook. Now, taking those sort of slight indications of a willingness to shift in China and Russia, overwhelmingly, if and when international reaction comes to atrocity crimes, it is so often from that playbook, and already elite perpetrators know that they need to price those costs in. That's one of the things that Putin got wrong, is that he priced in what had been done before but hadn't priced in the things that are being done differently. And so actually that means that then the responses are very ineffectual. A more strategic approach to prevention focuses on means, so the means that you have at your disposal to commit those crimes, and the architects, so those individuals, the groups, the transactions that perpetrate or enable or profit those crimes in the first place. And I think we need to take a far greater proportion of our time to untangle the human and transactional relationships that perpetuate atrocity crimes, because doing so will encourage a far, far more creative and evidence focus on how these networks can actually, in a very practical and real sense, be mapped, tracked, disrupted, and dismantled. And to me, this is a way of thinking that is rooted in viewing mass atrocities and the bonds or agreements that enable them from the perspective of perpetrators or would-be perpetrators. And I have always felt that that is where we need to start, if we're talking about prevention, because those are the behaviours we need to change. Those are the pathways we need to interrupt. So I like to use the term architectures of violence because it helps me to kind of visualise these structures, the kind of maps, right? Or like networks you can kind of imagine, I don't know, like pins on a board, and you could kind of do spider diagrams or whatever it is, right? But you can map these relationships very, very practically. And having that focus on relationships of command, of control, of communication, of transaction, of influence that connect in any architecture of modern mass atrocity. Some state actors, localities, organised crime, ordinary members within society that are influential, with those armed actors. If we're able to map and track these complex criminal architectures, we then, I think, have a far fuller spectrum of entry points. Because if you take that map and you put it against your own state levers of influence and of sanction, and perhaps of condemnation, and your toolbox, which might be limitations on supply chains, cleaning up illicit finance, thinking about where programming might be best oriented. In fact, thinking about how law enforcement, rather than military personnel, might be effective in deconstructing organised criminal components that are responsible for not just sort of the human trafficking part, but also the weapons, the drugs and the money that supply, more non-state actors in the work that they're doing there. Think about the borders, think about the travel visas. You then have actually not just 3 or 4 stayed options of how states and partners and networks of states can respond. You have an extraordinary spectrum of opportunity, but what you need to bring to that is strategy. And that is what is just not being done now. It is not. I mean, I do wonder, could an early and effective mapping of the networks that were supporting President Assad in Syria, that had mapped those paramilitary networks, that were mapping where the weapons were coming from, that mapped the social media influences that were sanitizing the Assad's good name, whether in Vogue or on Instagram. If we'd had a really effective map, and that had been kind of put through the filter of what states could actually have done, there wasn't appetite to do a military response in Syria, and that is a different conversation to the one we're having now. The option should never have been to do nothing, or just to respond to the the non-political humanitarian crisis. I do wonder about that. So I really, really do think that this stasis that has characterized international state-level atrocity prevention for, I think, at least the past decade, if not longer, I do think it can be undone. And we need to undo it if we are to then look further down the line of those atrocities that are coming, because we have to break this culture of impunity. We have to break this sense of disappointment of what the UN, the systems, the promises of human rights are letting down. And I think we have a whole spectrum of tools and opportunities and interventions that can be unlocked if policymakers and those of us whose job it is to support them take a more strategic approach to preventing mass atrocities, one that is rooted in a deep and nuanced understanding of those multidimensional realities of the architectures of violence. I think states have to take a lead in doing that. I do. I think that we need to recognize that that leadership is the only way fundamentally we are going to get through this kind of deadlock, both that we're seeing in the multilateral level, but also in the sense of actually preventing a pathology of violence that is destabilizing the world and causes immense human suffering. So that might require such a significant shift in how the policy is sort of recognized within government, or the policy need is recognized within government and bureaucracies. It's not an expensive one though. You just need to have some smart people and some smart systems. And given the immense costs of the humanitarian response to any of the crises that we are currently facing, not to mention that bleak horizon that I have painted that is coming down the tracks, the investment in that kind of strategic thinking, particularly for states like mine, the UK, we have an absolute crashing economic crisis. We will only have fewer resources. We will never be able to be everywhere. It is perhaps slightly different to the US, but the US also can't be everywhere all of the time, nor should it seek to. Being smarter with less is an unfortunate reality that we face at a time where the scale of the challenge is truly becoming existential. But thinking about preventing mass atrocities as strategy, recognizing the human, financial, and security costs of not succeeding, there I feel like we have enormous opportunity, and in a very practical way. It's not idealistic, it is actually strategically possible. So those are my 3 pictures to you. We change how the problem is conceived, we open it up, we stretch our timelines, we have to think of a way of securing prevention politics. That's the one we have to win. But in the meantime, there are these very immediate strategic decisions that can be taken that laser focus on those kind of like nodules of influence that change behavior and can save lives almost immediately. Thank you so much.
All right, great. We have some time for questions.
Thank you so much for being here. That was an amazing presentation. You mentioned something about practitioner work and a lot of youths nowadays avoiding the political sphere of these work. And I mean, it kind of got me thinking because that was something that I wanted to get into, but then I realized, you know, the toxic game of politics, and even though a lot of people might be able to play that game, some choose not to. I do. So I kind of wanted to see, to have you kind of like expand on your reason for that kind of like advice, even when, you know, someone may not see positive depiction of themselves in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I share and understand and hear a lot that reluctance of getting into a fray that doesn't represent anything close to kind of the system that you want to work within, the culture of work, the values, like the political home, you know, all of it. I really do understand that, and it is a very common sense. Why I recommend it is because none of us are currently there in it. And there is a reality that you are able to change systems in a very different way if you're part of it. That doesn't mean you don't make the sacrifice or you don't make the compromise. I mean, I still think a lot of the work that I've worked with a Conservative government in the UK since Protection Approach is set up. That obviously means I'm making compromises in a lot of the work that I'm doing to get in the door. So we all do it and navigate that political space, and it has to be a personal choice. But I do realise that in not becoming involved in those political opportunities when I was younger, and not just me, I'm not saying I could have saved it, but like all of my peers, all of my colleagues, none of them have jumped in because they've had very similar positions to that, you know, that you've just set out, and we're paying for the consequence of that in the UK. And I do wonder, maybe we should make a kind of collective pact and like jump together, or we should think about how you can set up a kind of pathways into politics, if there's kind of a different kind of funding and mentoring structure, but something that is going to funnel brilliant people that are going to kind of like really push that approach, because that's what the other side do. You know, they play the game and they, with really surgical precision, put people in positions of influence because they know that's how you win the game. Now, you know, it's a personal choice, and I recognise that I say it not, you know, being a politician. And it might just be because it's sort of like keeping me up at night at the moment, because we're on the edge of whether there'll be an election in the UK or not. So I don't know, I like to think that it is an option for everyone. I know that we didn't feel like that when I was at university, but I'm frustrated by that. So I understand, but I urge to think about how you can take your vision for the world into that space.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. But also, I like the fact that you are seeing a need of a change, and then we will go in the recommendations in that direction. Now, the Guardian reported that in 2050, 1 out of 4 people will be African. What do you think should be the investment both in Africa and around the world to ensure that that reality will not destabilize the world? Because it means that demographic reality will not destabilize the world, because you mentioned the migration and the movement. So my second question is about UN. Now of recent UN established youth office.
Yeah.
But when I look at that office, it doesn't make a difference with Antonio Guterres' office. It seems very bureaucratic. What do you think should be its role in down to top, approach to ensure that young people are engaged around the world in UN activities, but also playing a positive role in protection? And my last question is about the mental health and the healing. There are a lot of atrocities that have been committed, and one of the risks is that lack of validation of some of those atrocities can play a role in resisting to any global responses to those contexts. How do you think what do you think is the role of institutions such as I-GMAP to ensure that the inclusivity take into consideration of those griefs and to mitigate the risk that can come out of that?
Yeah, they are all 3 very meaty questions that I will not do justice to, so we shall talk afterwards, so I give you I attempt to give the answers that those questions deserve. I hadn't seen that data. 1 in 4 people in the world will be African by 2050. I mean, what that just says to me is that it sort of underlines that point that prevention is needed everywhere, all of the time. And thinking then about the strategist in me is like, well, then you kind of invest in all the extraordinary knowledge, colleagues that many of us get to work with, expertise around what, 1, the prevention of these crimes can look like, and 2, how to have a kind of global conversation about that, recognizing some of the shifts that are going to be changing in kind of the demography, and also within the global system itself. We won't have the same United Nations in 2050 that we have now. We can't possibly. I don't know what will happen to it, whether it will creak and something else will come out, or it will sort of find that evolution, because these demographic and political changes that are going to shape the world will need to have a UN that better reflects that reality. And currently it doesn't, and those changes are only going to continue to increase. So I don't know sort of what necessarily the dynamic change in terms of prevention will be with that demographic alteration or kind of trajectory, but I don't think it changes the premise of the need to be prepared. Perhaps it just adds further opportunity for African leadership in what needs to come next, I assume. With the UN and the Youth Office, and kind of how can younger people play a part both within that UN process but also more broadly? I think this is the hard thing about change and expectation, is on the one hand the creation of that youth office was really important because it, in a very practical, if only bureaucratic and performative way, means that there are agenda items and representations by that office on behalf of young people around the world, which previously was excluded from those elite conversations. But then at the same time, creating that office then raises the expectation of what such representations can lead to, And then you kind of have this like feedback of disillusionment and going, well, what have you actually changed? So I can kind of recognize that. I would say if you're interested particularly about how the UN can strengthen and better represent young people, lean into some of the more exciting conversations around what UN reform could look like. I think it can sometimes feel like, you know, in human rights history, there's a kind of period of push where it looks like nothing's going to happen, and then you get breakthroughs. And there will have to be some kind of change that happens within that UN system. And there are some really exciting movements around sort of placing civil society more central. Think about advocating towards the UN Office on Youth already, if you're not already. They very often are incredibly overstretched and need all the help they can get. You know, if you can come up with solutions, they very often will kind of listen, and maybe that's the thing you kind of realize when you're privileged enough to sometimes be in those rooms, is it actually what you thought was holding them back is very often just capacity. And so if you can help there, you know, you could well come up with some of the answers. And then the other, I kind of go back to my other call, like join in. You know, whether it's domestic politics or international politics, like just jump in. That's the best way to get change and kind of get your advocacy across, I think. Yeah, mental health and grief, we just have to keep getting better at it. I do think the sector has come an enormous way in the last 10 years in recognising trauma, secondary trauma, the impacts of the mental health toll it takes to work in this field, but also much, much more importantly, the mental health toll of those that have a closer proximity to the violence. And so that trajectory is progressing, but it's just going to have to be a prominent and growing strain of our work as we go, I think. So that's not a remarkable answer, I'm afraid, but is to reiterate the importance of the question. Sure.
So I just want to start off with a caveat and say a lot of what I'm about to say is just off the top of my head, so I don't
Right.
have a lot figured out. But I just recently came back actually from the UK, and I was lucky enough to work with the National Crime Agency over there for a little while.
Great.
But what was interesting over there is whenever America had a mass shooting incident, they would always ask me, you know, like, what is with America and everything like that. And when I started to look into mass atrocity prevention, I sort of realized that, or the way I've sort of scaled it down in my mind and tried to understand it from my background, is it seems like a lot of times our reaction to these events are like America reacting to a mass shooter, where we're trying to prevent it afterwards. We have to install more cameras, install metal detectors around doors, something like that, trying to say, well, it can't happen again. But when you are looking at other crimes, a lot of times what they do, you mentioned mapping before, is they're looking at crimes taking place in certain areas, and then what they do is they target areas around it to stop the prevention of similar crimes being spread, or if it's a serial offender, trying to limit the scope of what they're doing. I guess my question is, has your organization started to look into preventing atrocities by not just focusing on where they're occurring, but also the areas immediately around them or most susceptible to being influenced by what's going on in those areas?
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot I would like to talk about the National Crime Agency and how they have some of the skills that I do think is what actually atrocity prevention could learn from, particularly in approaches to serious and organised crime. You know, that's where I borrowed a lot of the kind of like network analysis, mapping, and strategic approach. And Serious and organised crime is recognised as both a domestic and an international challenge, and so in the UK, and I think it's the same in the US, it falls across our government departments, and they have a big national strategy on it, and then they have resource on it. The problem, of course, is that a lot of that law enforcement and intelligence work is taken forward without a human rights framework. And so, I mean, it's the same kind of mapping terrorism and extremism. You know, again, some of the practices I think could be strategically very useful, but at the moment, the majority of the institutions where that knowledge is held have very, very problematic human rights records.
Yeah.
So
another, yeah.
So that's the kind of context, but I agree that in terms of taking that mapped approach to where the violence comes from and what enables it, I completely agree. Nearly all architectures of atrocity crime that I have assessed or read other people's assessments of, they're nearly always transnational these days.
And the Internet Watch Foundation
Mhm.
also does similar sort of things
Right.
with mapping online and seeing how it's on
Right.
websites. So
So it's also this kind of really emerging frontier of what you can do online with open source reporting, and there's sort of this like, you're seeing this movement around these tools on the adjacent areas of atrocity prevention, but it's not yet touching conflict prevention, atrocity prevention, a little bit on sanctions, and Ukraine has stimulated this, even though actually there's been some really interesting practices around sanctions in South Sudan, or towards South Sudan, for example, that are much longer histories. So yeah, I do think that there is sort of some learning there, but it's the absence of the human rights framework that causes us in this room probably to pause. That doesn't mean the tool itself isn't helpful. It's interesting, your kind of parallels around shootings in the US and then sort of atrocities elsewhere. It certainly speaks to something around prevention, and where those blocks come in on the policy level. But I do think the context in the US around the shootings is very, very different,
oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
because there's also some very clear options on what could be done and very clear evidence that it's not being done.
Yeah.
I don't think we have the luxury of that knowledge or clarity necessarily to the same degree in atrocity prevention, but I might be wrong.
And can I ask one more
Sure.
somewhat related question? I remember there was your organization was mentioned in the Laws Commission Act. Is that what it's called? About
I'm now
potentially-
terrified about
potentially,
you.
about potentially establishing like the position of a hate commissioner. or
Oh yeah,
something.
probably, yeah. That
Oh, I
sounds-
was gonna ask if there was an update to that, because last I knew.
I don't know if there is, as far as I know, they're still considering it, yeah. But no, that does sound like something that we would do. Yeah,
I was very interested in how you said that with climate change, there's reduced resources and that can lead to more atrocities. Have you found that your organization or mass atrocity organizations have been able to work with climate change organizations together to decrease both of them, or because of the politics game and like the ever looming like threat of both of them, does one detract from the other in the political sphere because to focus on one you have to focus on the other?
I mean, that is such a good question. I just don't know the answer. Not that I know of in the UK, and not that I know of in terms of public partnerships of partners that I know. That doesn't mean that partners aren't, doing that knowledge exchange and that thing that NGOs do well, kind of learn from one another. I have been very struck in the UK context where conversations around climate and conversations around atrocities are worlds apart. And that doesn't mean that climate organisations don't talk about the violence, and it doesn't mean that atrocity organisations don't talk about climate. They rarely seem to be in the same room. Like, that is maybe a slightly stronger binary than is real, but I actually do really think there needs to be some kind of, more than convening, but some kind of thought leadership around the role that climate plays in atrocity prevention. And certainly, like, we are thinking of what we can do in the UK, but I know that we're by far far from the only organisation working in this field that's sort of thinking about that. What I have seen less of is sort of where that climate movement is in the broader peace and security environment. So I think it's kind of a space that will grow out of need and so on. I don't think it's necessarily around competition for resources. I think it's probably that the resources are different. It's probably that the funding comes from different places. I mean, I don't mind saying we have sought money from peace and security funders to integrate climate, and they have said, no, you don't need to do that. So, like, and I know others that have sought to do that. So I think it's probably that where the money comes from is different. And then on the political space, within governments, within the UN system, they sat in different offices, right? And the UK is doing some fantastic work now centering atrocity prevention. Climate hasn't yet been mentioned, and climate sat in a different department in Whitehall. So I think there is a problem that we need to diagnose, but there might be others in this room that know more than I do about that. Sure.
So I know that you hold a certain level of expertise and interest in the R2P doctrine. I know you'd love to talk about it. So I think it's certainly illustrative of the short-sighted nature that you've been talking about in terms of the world's actions on atrocity prevention. I want to know what your radical view on the doctrine is. What sort of work can be done to the doctrine in particular that could give the world a better long-term lens on atrocity prevention?
I'd love to. Kerry's going to be like, we have to actually wrap this up. Why did you ask that question? I start by saying this because I'm a historian. And so I think I take a longer view more easily and naturally of what junctures in rights can lead to. And R2P has existed for about 5 minutes, 17 years, like really no time. What it has done to raise the expectations of an international community and subconsciously leads to the raising of expectations of publics around the world, I do think is extraordinary. I also still think that commitment by all states to recognise that the lives of populations that lie outside of their borders at times are more important than the principles of sovereignty. But I don't ignore the fact that R2P was an elite construct. I don't think it was necessarily a global north construct, but it certainly was an elite construct, and it certainly was not conceived as something that was going to be applied to the United States or the United Kingdom or Europe. But just because that's not how it was initially conceived, that's not what it says in the text, right? That's not what the principle is. And that principle, now it exists, does not belong to its drafters, right? It belongs to all of us. It also doesn't only belong to those rooms in the United Nations. And so long as it has some use, and it is for us to determine whether it does, I still think it's something that, it does something that nothing else does. Perhaps if we get a treaty or convention on crimes against humanity, that might go some way to providing an alternate vehicle. But so long as we think that it has some value, it is up to us to make of it as we will. I think we have seen in the last few years a real transformation of how R2P is talked about by whoever holds it in the UN office. And R2P is now discussed as first and foremost being the responsibility to prevent. Again, that isn't how it was talked about 17, even like, I don't know, 5 years, 10, I don't know, right? But it's changed. It's changed from now it's responsibility to protect is first and foremost the responsibility to prevent. There's also a language and a discourse around it, including from that office in the United Nations, around the fact that this responsibility begins at home, whatever state you are, and extends abroad. And that is important. And so what I would like to see happen is thinking about, it's this devolution of R2P that is something that is instilled in and replicated on the state level in a meaningful manner, rather than just the rhetorical. And that concept of a collective responsibility to protect is so greater than those paragraphs in the summit outcomes. Every single state, society, culture has some kind of principle that is comparable around responsibilities to protect those that are more vulnerable. And so in a sense, I think that it already exists far beyond that system, it always did. And it's just whether there is a vehicle there that helps to galvanize and helps to unite. I think that the evolution of the principle has been quite amazing, actually. That's not to ignore how it's been weaponized, instrumentalized, and kind of bruised. And it's not to disregard the crimes that have been committed in its name. But I'm kind of not ready to give it up to Putin's poor misappropriation of it. But I know that I am, it's not a universally held position. Yeah, please.
So you spoke earlier in your talk a bit about how the current crisis in Ukraine has presented a juncture by which we can make a choice in terms of bringing past failures into the conversation. And I was wondering if you could speak to some of the more definitive motivators that you believe are either underutilized or just non-existent in the conversation when it comes to changing like large global entities and their perceptions of preventative work, if not just the motivator of failing in the past.
So what I think can secure that motivation of big organizations and what failed previously, right? Like what's the difference between what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere?
Well, I've been like thinking through certain instances in which it's been so difficult to get large global like entities such as like the US or
Yeah.
the UK, like countries
Mm-hmm.
to kind of change their perceptions of how they do that preventative work as
Yeah.
you're talking about,
Yeah.
and what motivators might exist that we haven't utilized before to
Mhm.
get them to do so.
Yeah. I mean, I think the big one is self-interest. Like that is why people are doing things differently on Ukraine, fundamentally. Is because there's a much closer understanding of how that violence threatens European security, the future of NATO, oil and gas supply chains. And so it's that self-interest that has kind of squarely led. It's also the self-interest in the need to preserve the UN system. I mean, first and foremost, Putin is seeking to destroy Ukraine as it currently exists. Secondly, though, he's deliberately continuing his endeavour, decades long, to undermine the UN system. And that's why the nature of the violence is effective in pursuing both of those objectives. So I think that what we can learn from that, but was always true, is thinking how we can communicate why prevention is in the interests of states and why it's in the interests of the UN or other institutions that you might be thinking of. Because it's true that Barack Obama made atrocity prevention a matter of national interest. And I'm prepared to be corrected on this, but I kind of have always taken that position. Like at first I was like, yeah, that's brilliant, that's what everyone needs to do. Because in creating the Atrocities Prevention Board, that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been acknowledged as an issue of national interest. I don't know if that statement and that commitment came out of a true understanding of recognizing how these crimes truly impact US national interests and security interests, or actually it was a way of packaging US moral leadership, and that's why it was a matter of interest, because morally this is the right thing to do. And there is a difference there, recognizing on really strategic level that these crimes have national implications and national security implications for states. Unfortunately, in our state-led world, is what will lead them to properly centering the prevention of these kinds of crimes in their national architecture. That is what will give the resources, that is what will bring the strategic approach, and not just a kind of budget line that provides programming for it and some moral leadership. That's not to undermine the importance of moral leadership and programming, but it is not what leads to strategic change. So I slightly question whether atrocity prevention is actually considered a national interest in the US context. But that's the underutilized piece, I think. Sure.
Thank you again for that talk. I was struck by the beginning of your talk when you were mapping out the kind of conception of the problem and called for both more inclusivity and intersectional kinds of approaches. And I was starting to read, but I didn't get very far, in a project that you were involved in on queering atrocity prevention. And I'm thinking those might be connected, and
Yeah.
wondering if you could talk a bit about the latter project.
Would love to. It's a great project. So this is kind of, it came from the work of a colleague, Jess Gifkins, who's an R2P academic. She came and said, why is there this big gap in R2P literature and atrocity prevention work when it comes to LGBT rights? And also, we had a conversation around the trajectory that is very concerning in the UK around LGBT rights and particularly trans rights. And one of the great things about my job is that Protection Approach's mission is that we exist to help transform how identity-based violence is understood so that we can help transform how it's prevented. So queering atrocity prevention fell really clearly within that rubric because for some reason, the atrocity prevention sector hasn't really ever publicly acknowledged that LGBT, queer and trans communities is like part of who that work is for. And so we were able to kind of do some surveying to really test that hypothesis. I reviewed, I think, 14 or 15 of the publicly available frameworks of analysis that have those risk factors of where atrocities come from, what makes them more likely. Hardly any of them mention gender, and if they do, it's just women and girls. None of them, not one, makes any kind of reference around sexual orientation, the needs, risks, vulnerabilities of LGBT communities. And then the other survey we did was around sort of what others in the sector were doing. Tippy's work in the Atrocities Institute was a very notable exception in including both specific and inclusive ways of working. But it is a rarity in the sector. And so, yeah, we were able to sort of produce this thought piece, really. It's a kind of ideas paper, like I suppose a bit of a call to action for our sector. But we sort of started with the premise that, of course, LGBT people are part of the who atrocity prevention is for. And we also explicitly said, of course, also part of the who that R2P is for. And if you disagree with either of those positions, well, then there's a conversation to be had. So far, no one has done. But if you take that as a premise, then you have to make sure that the tools, the programming, the policy, the structure, the ways of working are fit for purpose. And that's kind of where we are right now. At the same time, I draw your attention to the report just published by the UN's independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. And he's just finished quite wide-ranging inquiry into the experience and discrimination of, discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in contexts of armed conflict and atrocities. And so it's now opening this pathway of work within the UN system and outside it, but again, unapologetically saying this is part of the peace and security agenda. So that is sort of what I'm alluding to, these kinds of pieces of the work, the pieces of the parcel of what an inclusive and intersectional approach to identity-based violence prevention and atrocity prevention looks like. Similarly, you could have a same conversation around disability, an absolute gaping hole in our work. And yet we know in context of armed conflict atrocity, those that are perceived to have mental or physical disabilities are much more likely to face compounded risks. And yet that's not how programs are set up, that's not how conversations are set up.
All right, please join me in thanking Kate Ferguson for speaking with us today. I think she'll still be up here if you have any other questions. Maybe
Sure.
field some.
Happy to.